Hi folks, welcome back. This video will hopefully demonstrate on how to do your raw processing based on exploring files through Bridge. So currently, if you'll notice on my screen, I have Bridge open, and in the left column there's the directory structure, and I've accessed the appropriate files that I need for processing. These are all raw files. Just a quick brief overview of a couple of things within Bridge. This is where you see the directory structure at the bottom, and I'm going to pull this up so that you can actually see if you have labeled any of your files. If you notice that there are certain labels, these then appear here, and you can review them based on the labels that you may have assigned to any particular image. Within this folder, I also have files of other types besides Camera RAW. So I have JPEG files, Photoshop documents, and TIFF image. And what I've done is I've simply checked on Camera RAW so that I can filter and see nothing but those files. Now, to access, generally speaking, if you just double-click on any RAW file, it should open up directly within the RAW processor from Bridge. To be a little more efficient, perhaps you may wish to work on more than one image at a given point in time. So in my case, for example, I'm going to take, let's say, I don't know, these 5 images to begin with. Now that I have these selected, what I do is I can either right-click in here and say Open in Camera RAW, or whilst these are selected, see where the cursor is? This little circular icon. This says Open in Camera RAW, and what will happen is that it should then, without bothering to open up Photoshop, open up Camera RAW, and you will see all the images that you had chosen on the left-hand side, which is also referred as the film strip. Now, beyond this, a very quick introduction to the tool sets. There are 2 sets that are immediately available. There's these tools at the top, and then there's a whole bunch of tool sets on the right. Tools on the top, some of them are intuitive. One is the zoom tool, the next one is the hand tool, the next one is the white balance tool, and then this is the color sampler tool. This is a targeted adjustment tool, and if you keep it clicked, any icon that you see with a little arrow pointing down implies that there are going to be other adjustments. The same adjustments that are available here are also interestingly available in this panel, and all of these are the same. So notice the corrections convert to grayscale, hue, saturation, luminance, and if I keep this clicked, you will see hue, saturation, luminance, and grayscale mix. The only thing that you don't really see here is the parametric curve. The parametric curve lies here, which is also called the tone curve. Okay? So be advised that these are very similar. Next one is the crop tool, and if you keep it pressed, there's multiple presets, and you can create your own custom presets to whatever size you may want. This next one, which looks like a little bag with a chain on it, is a straighten tool. The next one is a transform tool, which allows you to warp the image or straighten the planes and things like that. The next tool, which looks like a brush with the 3 dots around it, is a spot removal tool, and it can allow you to either heal or clone whatever area that you may wish to retouch. So once you choose this, different options open up here, and you have this type heal currently, and the drop down that you can allow yourself to change to the clone tool. This is a red eye correction tool. If you had taken a photograph with a flash and the flash reflected in the retina perhaps starts to appear red, so this will allow you to correct for that. The next brush is an adjustment brush, and it does a whole lot of things. So let me explain this a little more in detail. When you click on it, you will notice that the right panel also changes, and there's a whole lot of things that are going on in here. So I'm going to reset everything in here, and I should reset my sorry about that. I need to reset whatever adjustments that I may have made in here so that everything stays back to 0. And then the quick way of reverting all of these tools to their neutral value could be double-clicking on the sliders so that they simply all of the sliders will fall to the 0 value. And I'll later explain how else you can do that. One of the important things with the brushes is that if you have made no changes in any of the sliders, the brush will not work for you. So for example, if I just decide that I want to apply, since I've made no changes, Photoshop gives me a warning, says that it doesn't create because all the values are set to 0. So if you make any changes, then only will you be able to apply a brush. The important recognize with the brush is size, feathering, and flow and density. So you notice that as large the brush, you see better. There are two circular forms. One is dotted circle, black, and the other solid circle. The black line implies the primary area of interest, and the dotted line implies feathered area of interest. And right at the bottom of this panel, once the brush is selected, you have the flow and density. Simply explain the behavior of feathering first. I am going to increase the density to 100% and flow to 100%, and also activate mask and just apply this. So obviously no changes made, so I make the change. So you notice how it's sort of feathering softer along edges because of feathering. This was around midway point. If I completely eliminate the feathering, same adjustment, which is negative one exposure, I apply, you see that it's sharper along the edges. By the same token, if I go to my 100% feathering and I apply the same brush, it's even softer in comparison to the other one. And to delete or remove these, you can do any one of the following. Once this is active means that, let me show you what active means. So when I choose another marker, it disappears. So if I go back to the brush again, notice it's white. So if I click on it, then now it is active. So you can either right click on it, you can duplicate or delete or reset any of the corrections. I wish to currently delete it because I was simply sharing it with you. That's gone. So be careful of your feathering, of the flow, and of the density. Having lower density and lowered flow perhaps gives you, not so sure, it depends on your working methodologies, a little more control because you can work with another brush on top of that to really get refined controls. Then you come to the gradient tool, and again with the gradient tool very similar options will become available to you. So watch how the right panel will change as soon as I choose the graduated filter. So some things disappear, but some things are still there. And the way it functions is that you can click and drag and drop in any direction that you may wish, provided you have already made a change, and then it implies itself onto that space. Excuse me. You also have the ability to further edit it. So just for the sake of argument and just to explain, I'm going to make it quite extreme so that you can see the change in here. And I shall pull it down. But now I don't want it influenced in this region. So if you look at the top right over here where my cursor is, it says Edit and Brush. So I want to choose the brush, and what it will allow me to do is then allow me to choose a particular brush size. Notice size, feather, and flow. So I'm going to increase my flow a little bit, and say, hey, I wish to eliminate from here. And just to show you what the behavior of the gradient is, I'm going to activate my overlay mask so you can see. So notice how the magenta is peaking over here. So if I come in here, incorrect, because I had the plus symbol on, I need to subtract and erase. So as I push it in, I am eliminating that part and the influence of that. By the same token, if let's say for the sake of argument I wanted to change something here and eliminate it, so I can simply drag and drop, and notice the influence in that region has been eliminated. So now when I switch off the mask, you can see the change. So be careful of how you utilize it and what you do with it. So I want to sort of get rid of it, and again I can right click in there and say duplicate or delete if I wanted to duplicate it. So I want to just delete it. The radial gradient, radial filter, it has a very similar behavior. So for example, if I wish to, let's say, darken the sky over here, I can draw it and modify it any which way that I want, and modify things. So it's going a little out of my image, so I'm reducing the image and bringing this in, and perhaps here. So notice one thing over here, right at the bottom, it says, do you want the influence on the inside or the outside? So again, these are choices that you can make. So it's the influences specifically limited to the inside in this case, and if I went outside, the influence would then be on the outside of the image. Having done that, I will again delete it. The next one is about preferences. So when you click on your preferences, it shows you how you may wish to handle it, and you can, if you have JPEG files that you wish to work with the RAW processor, perhaps it may not be a bad idea to say something over here as to automatically open JPEGs with setting or open all supported JPEGs. Do not, if you have disabled JPEG support, then the JPEGs will not be editable with the RAW processor. Okay. Similarly for TIFF files, TIFF is another image file format. Then we have the rotate counterclockwise to the left and rotate clockwise to the right, and toggle mark for delete. So these are some of the basic tools at the top. Most of the other edit tools, for example, each one of these little icons has a subset of controls built into it. So this is a basic adjustment, this is a tone curve, this is details and sharpening and noise reduction, this is hue, saturation, luminance and conversion to grayscale, this is about split toning, this is about lens profiles, this is about any effects you may wish to have. This is the camera calibration, depending on what process you're using. I definitely recommend using the most current. If you're using Photoshop CC, then 2012 would be the right choice. If any one of you is using an older version of Photoshop, perhaps CS5, you may not have the 2012 available, so perhaps you'll be stuck with 2010. And then here there are presets. You can create your own presets of how it behaves, and then you have something called Snapshot, and I'll explain all of these as we go along. So to begin with, the first thing that I notice in this image is that it's a little wonky, it's a little crooked. My horizon line is not straight. I wish to straighten the horizon line. So remember this tool where my cursor is, the straighten tool. So if I double click on it, it should by default straighten it, but as it straightens it is also telling me that, hey, you're going to lose some of the areas because since you're straightening it because of the angles. And I said, okay, that's fine. So once I'm happy with this, I can hit the enter key, or you can double click within that frame, the crop frame. So now the image is centered, balanced, and it looks fairly decent. The next thing that you can do if you are in doubt, Photoshop can do a lot of thinking for you. One of the things that I recommend before making any changes other than perhaps just straightening is going into the lens profile and watch what happens to the image. Definitely check remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections, because every lens will create some level of distortion, barrel distortion, or whatever it may be. Enable lens profile. So I'll switch it on and off, and you can see how the image kind of straightens itself a little bit. And Photoshop is smart enough to recognize what lens was used and so on and so forth. If you wish, and if you do not see your lens, you can definitely go into the manual process and create your own distortion amount level control by using correction amount, vignetting, and going through the manual and going through this distortion. In terms of color aberrations, you can also try and control any fringing or whatever that may be happening because of a poor quality of lens or a bad coating. So now I have straightened the image. I have assigned a lens profile. I go back to my basics. Before I begin the processing of my image using the basics, let's talk a little bit about the histogram. So this histogram is no different than the histogram that you have on your cameras when you review an image's exposure and everything else. At the top left and top right, you have little markers. These are what you call clipping warnings. So it's a smart idea to click on it so that the white outline shows through. I already have them pre-clicked. The other thing which is pretty cool in ACR is you can actually keep your cursor on the histogram, click and drag in any particular direction to modify the behavior of that area. So notice I was in the midtones. I can come to the shadows and drag it towards the shadows, or I can come to the highlights and I can drag my bright areas to the right. So it's kind of doing it by itself. That's one way of doing it. The other way, which is a relatively new introduction, I'm going to reset it if you don't mind to what it was, other than just the straightening of it. And besides the straightening, my lens profile. So now that I have this, next step that I can, and what you should consider as a starting point, is explore the drop-down menu and see what might work better for you. So this was very late in the day. So I might say cloudy, and the colors change, which look a little more realistic than what they were apparent in the image. Or if you don't want, leave it to as shot, and then while holding your shift key, bring your cursor to each one of the sliders beginning with temperature and keep the shift key pressed and double click on it, and Photoshop by default will determine what color temperature it was supposed to be. Still keeping the shift key depressed, double click on the tint and see what happens, and it becomes a little different. Same thing can work with your exposure. So it adjusted based on its own information. Contrast will work the same way. Highlight will work the same way. Shadow will work the same way. So I'm simply holding my shift key and double clicking on these sliders, and then to the white, and then on the black. So Photoshop thinks that this is the best choice. Perhaps it is, perhaps it is not. Because notice I'd activated my clipping warnings on the highlight and on the shadows, and this is where the highlight warnings are coming in. And just to show you how this behaves is I'm intentionally going to overexpose through the slider, and you notice how it is showing me where the areas are that might be clipped. That's one. If I were to go towards the dark side, you will notice that there are certain parts of the screen that are becoming blue, and they are now clipped. So it's a choice that you need to make. Now, at the same time, if you keep without making any changes, and I'm going to revert back to 0 for a second, all my sliders so that I can perhaps better explain. So this is bringing me back to exactly where I was. So I'm going to ignore my color temperature for a minute. But this time, as opposed to pressing the Shift button, I'm going to press the Alt Option key on the Mac, or just the Alt key on a PC, and come click and keep it clicked the exposure slider. So you notice the screen goes black. Now I'm going to start moving it to the right, and I keep moving it to the right until I start to see, and if I leave it here, you will notice that somewhere in here there was a little bit of a red blob that had started to show. So I don't want any highlights that are getting washed out, so I'll just keep it about here. By the same token, contrast will not work with this because contrast is a personal choice and it has nothing to do with highlights or shadows per se in this case. Then I go to highlights and I keep my Alt Option key pressed, and then I again start to use the slider to the right, and I'm pretty okay. And if I go to the left, there's nothing clipped, so I can actually push the highlights quite a bit, and the image is beginning to look pretty nice and bright. Then comes my shadows, and again Alt Option key pressed, and you notice at the bottom left there's a bit of green, so you may want to have some nice rich blacks in there, but make sure they're not too much, otherwise your image will not reproduce quite well. So this is a tiny bit, and I can always go in locally and adjust that, or I can open it up and see what I may prefer. So I don't know, I kind of like the details here. So you can also, without holding, see where your image may look the best to you. White will do the same thing, so I'm going to go see. As I go to the right, it starts to show me clipping, so I'll just bring it in. These two little markers I'm going to do local adjustments on. Blacks, again, where do I see the blacks? Not really anywhere. Now, so this doesn't look too shabby. If I enlarge the image a little bit for you, wait for this little error to finish refreshing your image so that you can see the details. What happens if I add a touch of clarity? Or I'm going to do more. So you will notice that the contrast becomes a little more obvious. Slight bit of change. Less, and it appears to be a little sharper. So you may not want too much, but you may wish to exploit that. Now that I have done this, my base exposure, I may wish to add a little bit of vibrance because this was a very late setting sun, and perhaps a little bit of saturation, which makes it look pretty darn rich. Having done the basic, now I come to using a few other tools. One of the tools that I wish to exploit is the Radial Filter. So I'll take the Radial Filter and I will assign a little less exposure and perhaps a little bit of saturation, and I'm going to apply it on my sky region and move it around and see. I don't really want to go over a few things unnecessarily because then you have to clean them out. So let's say I've done this, and once I have that, I can now choose what kind of exposure do I want. So now interestingly, it's doing the outside but not the inside. So what I need to make sure is that at the bottom the effect is set to the inside of the circle, and I'm going to feather it a little more and then start to modify my exposure a little bit. So here you notice the clouds start to look very dramatic. I'm also going to kick in a little bit of contrast, perhaps add a little bit of warmth and maybe a hint of magenta in here, and maybe a little bit of clarity, which will sharpen the whole thing. And let's see, if I add a touch of dehaze, it becomes a little richer yet once again. And once I hide this overlay, you will notice how much nicer the image looks. So that's one that you can play with. Now, this was the Radial Filter. Now when it comes to the graduated filter, I wish to apply it down here. So I don't really want to darken this, but perhaps I want to give it a little bit more detail and a little bit more saturation in certain areas and so on and so forth. So I'm setting my stuff to 0, all the sliders, and giving it just a hint more exposure. Come to the bottom, and if you wish to constrain the gradient in a straight line, you should keep shift pressed while you're drawing the gradient. So I'm going to draw the gradient up to here. And to be able to see the gradient's behavior, notice it's barely coming in here, and I can always clean that out. So I'm going to switch off my mask and then choose what is it that I wish to do. So I'm going to add a touch of clarity, a little bit of saturation in here so that this orangey reflecting sun can show itself pretty darn well. Maybe a little bit more contrast, and see what happens if I increase my highlights. I'm doing pretty okay. Shadows, if I open up, again, personal choices. I don't mind a little bit more. The whites, not too white. I want to keep it a little on the low side. And in terms of the blacks, notice how I go and it becomes dark. So you don't really want to go dark on it. Do I want to modify my colors in here? I've already done that a little bit. Now, remember what I had said, that you can eliminate the top part if that is bothering you. Activate the mask. Go into brush, make sure you have the minus, choose an appropriate brush size and the feathering on it. I'm going to reduce my feathering a touch, and I'll click in here and go all the way to the opposite and eliminate this. So I have successfully removed any influence of this gradient over here in the top part because I didn't really want it. And I'll switch it off. Now I decided that maybe it would be interesting to darken the sky a little bit more and have a little more snap overall. So I could go into my, again, the gradient mask, and this time around I'll again set this to 0 and I'll say new. So everything is to 0 once again. This is just a safety precaution. You don't have to do it. And I'm going to reduce my exposure and increase my contrast, a little bit of the highlights, and then click and drag it down. And again, let's see how much influence does it have on the building over here. Barely noticeable, and you can always clean it up if that's what you wish to do. So now I have this. I could increase the overall saturation. I could brighten or darken using the blacks, brighten the whites or darken the whites, open up the shadows or reduce the shadows. These are again very personal choices that you're going to be making in terms of how much influence you want. I'm going to add a hint more clarity to it because I would like to see a little more contrast and sharpness in there. That doesn't look too bad. Now, having done this, the next step, so to get out of any of these tools, you need to move out from here into any one of these tools. So the most convenient one is the hand tool. Then I'm also noticing that there are certain areas that have been clipped over here. So perhaps I am going to pull back on my highlight slider a touch more. And as I keep pushing it down, there we go. Now it's gone. There is no rule that says that this is what you need to do first or this is what you need to do last. These are all purely personal choices that you will make. Next one I'm going to go to my sharpening, the details. Now sharpening also is a very interesting one. You don't necessarily want to over sharpen things, but you do want to sharpen all the images. How much sharpening is good? That's something that you'll have to figure out depending on the resolution and what the end product may be in terms of is it going on the web or is it going to be printed or whatever it may be. So while you are here on the slider, click on Amount and press Alt Option. So you notice the image goes black and white. And if I increase it, what I'm doing is, basically what it has done is, it has changed the image into a black and white, and the influence of sharpening is primarily exclusively on the highlight region. So I don't mind this. Then I go into my radius, and this is where those highlights become visible. So you can modify your radius and see how much of an influence you want. As I go to the left, less it is. As I go to the right, more it is. So this is how you determine how much you want. In terms of the details, this is pretty cool. Again, same idea. Notice the differences, subtle differences in the water, less change, a greater level of change. And masking is pretty awesome. Click, press Alt Option, and then start modifying. So you will notice that you will see it as a black and white, and only where you see white will the influence of sharpening will be applied. So now that we have done this is about noise reduction. What I want to do is enlarge the image for you so that you can see what the differences are when we do a comparison to what the image was and what the image is now. So towards the bottom of the screen where I'm moving my cursor, the very first icon, which looks like a Y, it says cycle between before and after views. So if you click on it, that is the difference. So this is where the original image was, and this is where I have successfully managed to bring this image up to this point. So I can click in here and just simply say single view and do Command 0 or Control 0. This now is beginning to look very, very nice, I think, and it looks pretty cool. Other things you can do if you wish to add localized contrast or enhance particular colors in here. So for example, if I go into my hue, saturation, and luminance. So let's say if I go into my saturation, just for the sake of argument, and there's a whole bunch of oranges in the sky and the building that is reflecting the orange. What happens if I reduce it? You notice that not a whole lot of other colors are influenced, but specifically that particular color. So you can actually enhance the color here a little bit. If let's say it's the blues that you were working on, lighter blues or perhaps darker blues. Whatever you wish to do, these then become your personal choices. I hope this is making sense. In terms of hues, you can modify the hues of particular colors if you so desire. And in terms of luminance, luminance would imply the brightness or the lack of brightness of a particular color. So let's say if I am going into the blues, I want to darken the blues, and I'm not really changing the color, I'm simply darkening the blue. Again, a very personal choice, and the influence is also reflected in the histogram. And if I go to the right, I am simply brightening the blues, so the luminosity value of the blues. So you can play around with all of these sliders and see where and what you achieve. Now, remember these two little spots, I have to fix them because they are out of gamut. So to be able to fix these, I'm going to take the exposure adjustment brush. And again, as I choose the exposure adjustment brush, a whole bunch of sliders become available. So what I want to do is use an appropriate size brush. I generally recommend working in large scales. So I have a very small brush and I'll apply it here. And once I've applied it, I am going to simply reset all the corrections. Okay? And then decide how much of an influence I want on it. So once I'm happy with this, I can apply it here as well. So my mask is active, so I'm going to deactivate the mask. And notice the changes as I increase or decrease my exposures. So I'm going to apply it regularly and a little bit more, so I can increase my density on the brush if I wished a little more of an influence. And these are little dabs that I'm making, but it's the little tiny details that make or break your image. So now that I have done that, I go back, get out of there. That looks actually very, very decent at this point in time. So now, if you're not sure whether this is the right choice or not the right choice, and whether you wish to do any more processing, the smart thing to do is you should create a history reference for yourself, which is called a snapshot. So you notice the top right, which looks like multiple pages, click in here. And it says Snapshots. So right at the bottom, there's a new page icon. Click on it, and this becomes your new snapshot. So I'll say process stage 1, just so that I know. And once having done this, I decide that, I may want to use a few other things. And what I'm looking for is perhaps, and this is just a loud exploration, I take my adjustment brush, make it fairly large, and I'll keep my density around the 50 mark. So here we go. And I am going to leave my exposure alone, but I am going to desaturate a few colors. Because I thought, what if the water looked a little more neutral as opposed to blues in some areas? Okay, so I will apply this. And to see how and where you're applying, you can activate the mask. So I'm applying it here, and I'm going to scoot through here, maybe a little bit in here, and then perhaps touch in here, leaving a little bit of the space. And you may need to adjust your brush size as you work along in different areas. But now it has spread over into the foliage region, so I gotta go into erase and take a relatively small brush, click once in here. Since it's a straight line, since I've clicked once, I press shift, I go to the other end, and boom, all gone. And you can refine it until you're happy to what you are doing. Let's see what the influence is. So I've done that, and I'm intentionally going to desaturate it completely for you to see the differences. It's going to be hard to tell whether there is or there isn't any color in there. So if I increase it, notice how blue it goes. I'd reduce it. It doesn't, because my brush flow and density were low, it's not having a huge amount of influence. By the same token, if I decide that I wanted these oranges to be a little richer and brighter, I could take a new brush, and perhaps this time around I may increase the density and the flow a little bit, and gently with a small brush come in here. Notice it has still got the same old setting, so what it's really doing is it's desaturating the colors. And just to see where my mask is going, I'm going to activate the mask right at the bottom so that I can see, yep, that looks pretty reasonable. But this time around, I may choose to actually saturate it more, and maybe even give it a little bit more exposure or contrast added in there. So suddenly the image starts to look pretty rich. And I may add a little dehaze to give it that subtle bit of clarity as well. Et voila. And there you go. Now once you've done this, since you're working with the raw file, it is not a bad idea to set your preferences to, guess what, 16 bits per channel. Leave it to whatever your original size of the image was, however it may be. Leave everything alone. And suggested profile for the time being is Adobe RGB 1998. Once you're done with it, what I can now do is perhaps go back into my snapshots and create another snapshot and say stage 2. Now that I have these two snapshots, I have the ability to do a comparison between the two and see which one I may prefer. And how simple can it be? You simply click on stage 1. This is what it looked like. Stage 2. This is what it looks like. The only real difference is in the color saturation in the water in the foreground. That's about it. I kind of like it this way, personally speaking. So I may wish to leave it alone. When I look at my histogram, I really don't have much of a problem in the histogram other than a tiny bit of clipping and just the blues over here, and I am not too worried about it. Once I'm done with it, you have an option of either saving the image or opening the image to further work in Photoshop. That's one thing. The next thing is, now that you have done this, what if you had other images that you had shot at the same time under a very similar light condition? You may wish to then apply these same settings to other images that you may have worked on. And we're talking about the general global settings. So you notice this icon which looks like sliders which says preset. I click in here and I can come in here into the flyout menu and say save settings. And by default everything will stay checked. You don't necessarily want to apply the auto tone adjustments unless you have done that. And there you can choose certain subsets or do what you need to do. Simply hit save. It'll potentially ask you for a name. You can place them wherever. Generally speaking, I would leave them in the settings because this is going to be an XMP file. So I'll call it Ottawa River. That's all. And I save it. So notice it has now appeared over here. So what if I had done the next shot, which is this one, perhaps in the same place, but I didn't. These are two different settings, but this is just to demonstrate what is going on. So if I now want to apply the global settings across the board on this particular image, I simply click on this and there you go. So it has applied all those settings right in there in one quick stroke. I hope this makes sense. So I'm going to go back here and now there are additional things that you can do to this image in Photoshop or whatever you want to, or maybe even in here. I don't know. These are going to be your personal choices. In this particular case, I may wish to come in here and brighten the greens a tiny bit because the greens were a little dead. And the aquas again with that, and maybe a little bit of yellow as well. Now I seem to be quite happy with it, and all I'm going to do is say open image. So as I say open image, you'll notice at the bottom in the dock Photoshop is bobbing up and down, and it is opening up Photoshop for me to do any further editing or processing that I may wish to. So I'll just wait till it opens up in Photoshop and then hopefully end this, because this is all about the basics of raw processing. So let's wait a few seconds and let's see what Photoshop shows it like. In the meanwhile, if you guys have any questions, you know where to get in touch with me. Don't hesitate, please, and I will be more than happy to get back to you, or perhaps create a second video which may be related to your specific questions, which may benefit a whole lot of other people in the course. So here we go. This is the final image just based out of the raw processor. What we do with it from here on is a very separate issue, and we shall hopefully talk about image processing beyond the raw stage in Photoshop. Until then, take care and have a wonderful day. Cheers.